canonical model is essentially how researchers, how Christians, how apologists define what they mean by canon. You see, in canonical studies, there's a lot of debate over terminology. What is the canon? A lot of emphasis is placed on where the etymology of the word comes from, that it means rule or standard, and where it's used in Scripture and those kind of things. But very little attention is honestly paid to how the model that we use to define the canon instructs what we think of it, even how theologically we represent it. And a canonical model, being our approach to the canon, is more than just a historical reference point. It is epistemologically how we understand the canon. It is theologically what effect we believe the canon has. And historically, it is how we see the canon developing. And so there are various models in use today. And in academia, there are at least two that are the most common. The first canonical model would be what's called the community-driven model of canon. And what that model states, essentially, is that the canon itself is the byproduct, or the books of the New Testament are the byproduct of a community of believers and the decisions that they have made regarding the books, that these 27 books will be what defines the church from this moment forward. And of course, in these kind of developments, a lot of times the community-driven model focuses on a date, a particular canonical date, rather than the canon as a development. So we see this in Protestant circles and Roman Catholic circles, and this emphasis on the 4th century. Usually in apologetic circles we see this a lot as well. An emphasis on the canon of the 4th century, and that being a definitive date and the like. But again, that's the community-driven model, and that is one of its emphases. And what the model is trying to say is that essentially the canonicity is not something that is intrinsic to the books themselves, but that it is something that the community imposes upon the books. And what this does is it places the human factor of the canon at the forefront of all determining models. And probably the most common Protestant approach, especially in apologetics, that features or showcases the community-driven model is the defense of Adolf von Harnack's statement, or his assertion, that the canon developed as a result of a reaction to the heretic known as Marcion. Marcion was a sort of Gnostic heretic who developed his own canon, excised the entire Old Testament, most of the Gospels, and focused primarily on Paul. And in a response, the church needed to create its own authoritative Orthodox canon to combat Marcion. So it was a historical byproduct that a community of believers created in response to this kind of event. And again, it places the impetus on the human aspect of the canon, and it affirms that canonicity was something that was placed on the books. Now, Harnack's approach was what we would call maybe a historical critical version of the community model. It's the type of thinking that came out of the Enlightenment and is very human-centered. It is, as we said before, the impetus is put on the human effort that imposed on the canon, the canonicity of the books. And one of the things that is elevated as a result of the human element is that, in reality, no book in the 27 books of the New Testament has any special value of its own. It is equal to every other book that might have been circulating at the time of the early church. The only difference is that these 27 books happen to be claimed by essentially the winning church. Again, this falls after things like Walter Bauer's thesis that there was no orthodoxy prior to the 4th century, that there was all these different views of different Christianities, and it was the winning Christianity that became the Christianity of the day. And this is, proposed by Bart Ehrman and other people as well. And what it's basically saying, again, from the historical perspective, is that none of these books are intrinsically valuable. They are simply special or unique because the church has said they are. So canonicity is something imposed upon them. And the byproduct of that is it delegitimizes the canon almost entirely. Because essentially what you're left with is that had another Christianity rose to the forefront, or had another version of Christianity taken the first step or the first leap into canonicity, we would have an entirely different canon. And the 27 books that we have are only unique because of the winning circle. And of course, the other byproduct is that without the community, if the community does not affirm or receive these books, then there is no canon. So the canon can't even be spoken of as having existed prior to the affirmation of the community. Now, another form of this community-driven model is the Roman Catholic model. And this isn't a jab at Roman Catholics in general, but it is a clarification that their model of canonicity follows into the community-driven model. And what that states essentially is that it is the church, or the Roman Catholic Church, the magisterium, that determined the canon. They set the limits to it, they identified the books that were authoritative, and without the magisterium, there is no way to know which books would be authoritative. And you might come across this a lot of times even in your social media sites and discussions with Roman Catholics in debate. You will often hear the claim that you wouldn't know what the canon is if it weren't for the church. And of course, this is an appealing element because when a Roman Catholic is challenged on the New Testament canon, they can simply retreat to the authority of the church. And they can say that the church has been given the authority of God, and the church defined the canon, therefore the canon is of God. And that's convenient. But again, it still places the impetus on human action, and reminds us that there's nothing intrinsically valuable about the texts themselves, outside of the fact that the community decided that. Now, the magisterium in the Roman Catholic model also holds the rights to interpret what is tradition, what is not, how to improperly interpret the scriptures, and how to limit the scriptures. So it places, whether consciously or unconsciously, it places the magisterium in a position over the canon. But again, we run into the same difficulty that the canon cannot exist prior to the Roman Catholic Church saying it did. And that runs into some issues because the Roman Catholic Church never made an official dogmatic decree on the canon until the 16th century in the Council of Trent as a response to the Protestant Reformation. Surely, they will claim that they were affirming and reaffirming the early councils that prior to them, but there has never been an ecumenical council in the time of the Church that officially proclaimed the canon of the New Testament for all the Church. So, up until the 16th century at least, as far as Rome is concerned. So that means for 1600 years there was no canon, which is a difficulty to overcome, especially when you consider the fact that the earliest Christians had a canon even during the development of the New Testament. And what I mean by that is the Old Testament existed. The Old Testament is what they appealed to. We read in the book of Acts that the Bereans tested Paul's teaching by studying the Scriptures. Well, the Scriptures at that time would have been nothing but the Old Testament. Everything that Paul would teach them about Jesus was referenced to the Old Testament. Christ appealed to the Old Testament. So there was a canon, and there was no magisterium at the time of the Israelites to determine what the Old Testament canon was, but the Old Testament canon existed, and it was well known, and it was received. So we run into a difficulty with that particular form of community-driven model. You often hear it stated that if we don't have the church or the magisterium defining the canon in this model, then we need a divine or inspired table of contents. And of course, if such a table of contents were to exist, the Roman Catholic could just retreat and say, well, you need a document that proves that that table of contents, that list of table of contents is inspired. And so if we produced a document that said the table of contents is inspired, they wanted a document that proves the inspiration of the document that proves the table of contents is inspired. And this could go on for an infinite regress, essentially building into itself a need for the church to make that proclamation. But there would be a need for a table of contents if the books of the canon of the New Testament bore within themselves a particular quality or qualities that defined canonicity, that the church did not place on it, but was only able to recognize coming out of it. And that's the difference in a community-driven model versus some of the other models that we will look at.